Okay, so we're back in Blender land, and we are going to just be taking a look at this rectangle, which is a tabletop, and we're gonna learn how to put some textures on it. It seems that some people are having a little trouble with that, so we will. Let me just switch this over back to 3D view here. We're gonna cover that, and this has already been unwrapped, so tab key here. We're in object mode, and the unwrapped template has already been saved out as this file right here. So we're going to open that up into GIMP. Let's go into GIMP. Okay, I'll grab this and just drop that into GIMP. Come on, GIMP. Oh, it's so fast. So the computer's running a little sluggish today. Alright, so here we have it. And this red thing is just really a UV. You can see where the UVs are. We're going to use it for that. And so instead of calling it redness, I'll just call it UV. And it's a good idea to label each of your layers as you're going along, sometimes even creating folders for them. So like if I had more, let's see, drop this baby in there. Isn't that great? Alright, whatever. So since this is going to be like a wooden table, I guess, a desktop, we're going to open up some wood textures. I've got some here. And you can get these on cgtextures.com, and there's some links also that I've got provided within the course info. Let's see, let's grab one here. These would be appropriate. A little too rough. Let's see if we can find a good one. There we go. Alright, I like that one. And the green's going in the right direction. I don't even have to rotate it. So I'm dragging this, dropping it into here. Let's see. It's taking a little bit of time. Here we go. And when I drop it in, it's going to go into a layer. Wow. You can see this. It's taking a little time. It seems this computer is really being stressed out by the screen capture. Okay, there it is. Yeah, and I grabbed two of them. And I'm just going to get that one out of there. Wow, everything is really slow. Here we go, drop it in. It's even taking a really long time to know where my cursor is. Alright, I'll just do it like that. Alright, and I'm going to get rid of this folder too. And so you can see this is existing as a layer. I'm going to call this color. Try to stay away from calling these things diffusion maps. If you look up diffusion, the word diffusion in the dictionary, it has nothing to do with color. It has to do with light scattering or scattering in general. It was sort of a mistake that got carried on through a lot of 3D applications. The only thing that really handles diffusion in a realistic sense is Maya and Lightwave. But here we go. Okay, this layer of the wood is laying on top of this red rectangle, which we're using to represent the UVs, tell us where the UVs are. And by using this move tool with the opacity set to 83, I'll turn it down a little more. you can see how the wood grain's gonna play over the top of the table. So maybe we'll use something like that. Bring it up to 100% again. Good Lord. All right, back to 100%, and you can see this wood is a little dark. So we'll just go into colors here, go to levels. And how levels works is you can consider this the mid-range contrast. I go back here, the contrast goes down to practically nothing, and here it pumps it right up. And then this is the highlights. So if I crank that up and crank the contrast up, now I've got a very high contrast image. And the higher I put the highlights, and the more I put the contrast, the darker the darks will get and lighter the lights. So there. But that's not what we want. I do want it to be lighter and retain some of its brown color. And I'll see that's alright. So there's our color map. And in GIMP, if you want to save this file out, you've got to go to export as, and I'm going to export this as a Targa or TGA, which is a lossless format. You want to use a lossless format like a PNG or a Targa. You don't want to use a JPEG. Although they're small, they can have video or artifacts from compression. And you don't want to use a PSD because they're too big. You don't want to use a TIFF because they're too big. So let's just name this wood underscore. Actually, I already have a folder on the desktop. So let's go to desktop, and I made a little test folder. So tabletop underscore C for color. And we're going to export that. So this is just the color component for the tabletop. And we'll load that on top of the Blender model. Yes, and we'll replace that. And we're not going to do any compression to it. I'm going to export it. Okay, and now we're going to make a spec map. So I'm just going to right click on that color layer and duplicate this layer. And our spec map is not going to have any color in it. You can have spec maps with color in it. It's usually, I usually only use that for metals. And so about 99.9% of the time they're grayscale images. And they're lighter, so less taxing on the game engine. So let's go to colors, hue and saturation, and we'll just bring that saturation all the way down so that it's black and white. And we'll name this spec or specularity. And if we left it how it is right now, this spec would be the specularity would be very little, and I want my tabletop to be somewhat shiny. And what specularity does is control, it's a fake for controlling how much light is reflected back from a surface. All specularity that you see in real life is reflection, light reflecting off the surface of objects or subsurfaces of objects. Sometimes it's more scattered, and some 3D programs allow you to control the roughness, which makes that reflection more blurry. And if there's no roughness, it's almost a perfect reflection. But this we're going to make shiny, and so let's go back to levels. And in levels, I'm going to bring the mid-range down, or the contrast down quite a bit, and make it much brighter. Want less contrast than that, because in these dark areas there'll be less specularity, and in these light areas there'll be more. That's pretty bright. I'll say okay for that one. This might be too shiny, but for the sake of showing what this is going to do, it should be okay. So I'll export that as tabletop underscore S for specularity, and we'll overwrite this old very dark one, and that's going to be saved as a Targa, TGA also. So let's replace that one and export with no compression. Good. Now sometimes in spec maps you want to add little dings and scratches which aren't on the wood surface. So it's a way of adding another layer of surface interest to your 3D object. And when you do that, how the hell do I move this into a folder? Move from visible and to layer mask. No. I should just be able to drag this up into the folder. Maybe it was just being really slow. No. Alright. I might have to get back to that. I'm used to it in Photoshop. But for adding these dings and scratches, I have a bunch of maps that I call black maps. And that's these. And they're just noisy maps from nature that have strangely perturbed surfaces. Some are color, some are black and white. But they're real good for adding organic types of scratches and dings to objects. So let's see, maybe I'll use this one. Okay, and I'm going to drag that into here. Now it's a layer. It's kind of big, so I'll scale that down a bit. Scale, fine. And we'll move it over here. I'll scale it a bit more. Alright. That should be good. And let's scoot that up here. Sometimes I'm scaling that wrong. It doesn't seem like it was really scaling. It was cropping. You can tell I'm not really great with GIMP. So let's see here. If I go scale by cubic, there we go. Oh Lord. Okay, I like that. Okay. Yeah, let's do that. Alright, still doesn't look like it worked. Alright, and for this layer, let's set to normal right now. I'll do it as a multiply, and I'm going to crank the levels up on that quite a bit. So go to levels again and make it very bright, because what multiply does is it just adds the darks. Once it gets up beyond the lightest color here, it won't show up. So we can get some good dings and scratches out of this. Then you move it around and see if you can find a spot that looks good. I'm gonna hide that. So yeah, these dark areas would have less specularity on them, and the center area would have more. So I'll show these guys again, and I'm going to lower this grunge layer here. Bring it down a bit more and make it more subtle. Yeah, that should be good. Alright, we'll try that out. And save as. Actually, I'm going to make it very obvious, and I'll save it out as a different version just to kind of show off the effect of that. I'll scoot it over here more. So that'll be really obvious. And I'll save this as spec map too. So export as tabletop S, S2. Alright, let's export that. And then we'll get back into the 3D model, and I'll show you how to put these on there. Oh my goodness. There we go. Okay, so let's go back into the 3D model in Blender, and you can see here it has this orange color to it. I'm just going to crank that up to white. 1, 1, 1, 1. Alright. And also this specularity just showing up on there. What is this set to? Switch it to material. And you can see that specularity is getting an orange hue. We don't want that. Although once you put a map in here, it'll override that. So anyways, we'll just switch it to 1. Okay. Now, in every other 3D program I've ever used, when you're in the material component and you're in the diffuse or color, you usually can click on here and you have the option of loading up your image into these slots, and it's connected. But in Blender's the only program that's like this, and that's why it's a little confusing. You have to go over to this one. This circle or this ball is the material, and this square with checkers on it is the texture. So in order to have textures on our material, when we're in Blender render mode or Blender game render mode, and I want people to use either of these two renderers, Blender render or Blender game. The cycles render, although it's a lot better, it has very little to do with game real-time rendering, and you got to learn to do the whole node setup for those, which is helpful, but for this case let's just keep it simple. And we're in this texture component. Let's say new, and it loads up by default a black texture, but this is where it's important. Coordinates are UV. Alright, and we're going to open a texture, so hit open, and we have let's see, desktop and that test folder, and we have tabletop color, so double click that. You can either double click it or click it once and go over here and say open image, but there we go, we've got that texture on there and it's already been UV'd nicely. So that automatically gets applied to the material, and here you can see we have a pretty high spec on this, but I'll just turn that off. And again, when I load a texture into here, it's going to control all of this. It's going to control the color, it's going to control the intensity. Cook torrents, I'm going to switch. Fong is pretty good for this type of surface. I always think of it as a more plasticky, really early CG look, and Blend's a little better than Fong. I tend to use Blend. So let's load in a spec map. So now you can see here's our color map, and this is what's important. This diffuse is color, and here we have that checked. Okay, if we don't have it checked, you don't see any texture. Color, and we're in material mode right here. We could be in texture mode. I'll get to that. Alright, so we're in material mode. It's showing up. Make sure color's checked on that. It is by default. Coordinates are UV. But what about our spec map? So we got to load that up. So let's go to another empty slot here. You click on that, and there's nothing. So you say new. And again, it does the same thing and loads up this blackness. Just say open, and let's load up our other texture from the test folder, our spec. So we'll load up this one first. And there it is. Okay, so you see what happened there. Now it just covered up the color. And what happened to the color? Well, it's still in there, but this one by default, since we loaded it up last, covers the original. And the reason that is because we have this color selected for the diffuse. Can't have two on there. So I'll turn that off, and we need to tell this texture that we just loaded up, our spec map, we need to tell Blender that that is a specular map. So we'll hit color, we'll hit intensity, and there, now you can see that the spec map is on there. And the spec map is showing specularity in the lighter areas and not showing it in these darks. So let me zoom out a little bit here, and let's grab this lamp, and we can move that around. You can see the surface a little better. Okay. So yeah, and I'll load up that other spec map. We'll use that. So let's load that up. Go back to, oh, I gotta make sure I select model. Right click on that, and go back to our textures, all the way to the top here. And grab this one, say new, and let's open up. Jeez, it never remembers where you are. Desktop and test folder, tabletop spec 2. So let's load this one up. Okay, and again it defaulted right to color, so we don't want that. We're going to turn that off, and we're going to turn on this and this, and it's overwriting the other spec map even though it's still turned on. I'll turn that off. So now you could see where we had those splotches. It's not getting spec, as if this tabletop were covered with something. And it's sort of a more realistic feel when you have that. Okay. There's a few things. There's other map slots in here. Your ambient, emission, which should be like if it's going to glow. Also down here you have geometry. This is called normal. Now, I've got our original spec map selected up here. If I hit normal on that, you'll notice that all of a sudden it becomes very noisy. And let me turn that down. But you could see the noise is following what was in that spec map. So how it's working is where there's highlights, these brighter areas, the surface is appearing to pop out. And where there's darker areas, the surface is recessed. And this is actually a bump map. It's not a normal map. And you can control it by the intensity here. So yeah, I went into the negative, so it made that the opposite. So light areas were pushing down and dark areas are pushing up. But here I'm in the positive, and now the light areas are pushing up and the dark areas are going down. And very subtle. So there, now it has a bump feel to it. Don't confuse this as being a normal map though. If you had a normal map, which are those kind of purpley looking images, you would go into the image sampling and you would click normal map, and you would use the default tangent space. It has a lot of different spaces: object, world space. But that's not what you want. You want a tangent space if we had a normal map, which we don't. we're just using the spec map as a bad bump map. So I'll turn that off though. Okay, so that's color and specularity mapped to a rectangle. All right, thanks.